1973 was an interesting time for Latin America. There was a real sense that perhaps a different path to revolutionary socialism was possible in the region, aside from seizing state power through armed means. And what Allende was able to do in 1970 when he was elected was to some extent bring that into reality, because here was an alternative to armed revolutionary struggle that nevertheless very much and openly about itself socialist undertook to create a much more social justice vision for Chile.
It's really a subterfuge-based non-war that is meant to counteract ostensibly or genuinely popular movement. Yeah. Not only populist, but popular movement. Yeah. Where finally the masses of Chileans who were underrepresented or not at all represented were starting to see representation. And the threat there for American dominance, and by extension the American empire, was people realizing that there is another way.
So yes, we have now evidence that certainly the CIA, but others were both covertly and in some ways overtly funding or helping to fund, for instance, magazines, parts of the media apparatus. Some of the civil society organizations that were formed in opposition to Allende also received funding through the CIA. In those important ways, Chile really stood as an exception to places like Paraguay, to places like Brazil, and now had to be contained in a different way. So the blockade that the US implemented beginning in 1972 was really aimed at squeezing the Chilean economy. In fact, those were the exact words that Kissinger used. By 1973, you had a series of smaller coups that really seemed to bring to the table that the Allende government was besieged from all sides. The kind of curious historical coda to this is that the person who would eventually oust Allende in September 11th of 1973, Augusto Pinochet, was actually Allende's defense minister. And in part, he was his defense minister because he had proven loyal to Allende in a previous coup attempt earlier in 1973. The coup itself was incredibly violent. All the branches of the military were involved in bombing, literally, the presidential palace to the point that Allende eventually died in the bombing. So that in itself, the idea of a civilian, democratically elected government whose seat of power, which is also the seat of power of the people in an electoral democracy, was being bombed, that was incredibly symbolic, that even that could be targeted quite literally for destruction. What followed was the spectacle of thousands and thousands of, especially youth, people who had been identified with the left being rounded up, brought to the National Stadium, tortured in the bowels of the stadium. People disappeared, never to be heard from again, which then became a standard operating procedure for dictatorships in the Southern Cone and other parts of the world going forward.
For me, the reason I wanted to do the show now is because this memory of 1973 does not end up kind of softening. These are artists who keep that rupture within them. And the reason that I wanted to focus on the future was because I don't find these artists to be bitterly nostalgic. They're more very conscious of that historical rupture and the violence that was imposed from within and without simultaneously.
Yeah, the forms of violence usher in its different forms of resistance that in the case of Chile really kind of pioneered a form of solidarity politics that brought together people who hadn't previously thought themselves as activists, now seeing the injustice and just the sheer brutality of what was going on. But then also, of course, artists who begin to, through their art, express solidarity with these movements as a way to propagate the message.
Do you think that something like Allende can happen now? And would the inevitable counter-response be something like Pinochet?
The reality is that I am always hopeful and I am always fearful. What the history of revolutionary movements in Latin America has taught me personally is that any movement towards justice will always engender opposition in a society that is massively riven by rich and poor, by dark-skinned and light-skinned, by men and women or others. And so every gain has to be met by the possibility that it could be lost.
And one of the things that's important to me in any kind of conceptualization of an activist stance is to never forget the ludic and joyous quality of being human. The attempt in the show, for my part, was to kind of just make something about work that addresses these current realities that doesn't forget the past.